Hey guys! Tonight we start with a question that will linger in your mind. What if I told you that in 1925 Paris, you could stroll into any pharmacy and purchase the same drug that ruins lives on American streets today, and it was entirely legal? What if the remedy your doctor recommended for a basic cough was in fact heroin? And what if some of America's most celebrated writers weren't merely sipping absinthe in Parisian cafes, but injecting the very drug we dread the most nowadays? This isn't made up. This is the astonishing real tale of how the City of Light turned into the world's initial heroin hub. Before we delve into this remarkable enigma as a team, hit that subscribe button immediately, because what you'll hear next will alter your perspective on both Paris and addiction permanently. And I'm truly interested. Are you tuning in at 2 a.m. like the majority of our group? Share your current time in the comments. I enjoy spotting our worldwide community of night owls. Now, lower those lights, settle in comfortably, because we're on the verge of stepping into a Paris you never knew was real. Picture this. It's March 15th, 1925. You're an American author disembarking from the boat train at Gare du Nord. The exchange rate makes your dollars go a long way, like enchantment. Rent is practically free, and each cafe offers the promise of artistic motivation. This is the Paris of your fantasies, Hemingway's domain, where ideas pour out like wine and liberty has a flavor sweeter than champagne. But here's the detail no one shares about this utopia. Within 6 months, 1 in 4 American expatriates in Montmartre will have experimented with heroin, not as a reckless form of defiance, but as a remedy following doctors' instructions. Let me astonish you with this detail. The Bayer Pharmaceutical Company, yes, the same Bayer that produces aspirin, was still promoting heroin in 1925 as the secure, non-addictive cough reliever. Their genuine slogan was, "Heroin, the sedative for coughs." Can you imagine that? They were actually positioning heroin as safer than alcohol. Dr. Auguste Morel, chief doctor at Hôpital Bichat, recorded something alarming in his personal journals. I'm quoting his precise words, translated from French. March 1925. I have cared for 17 Americans this month for what they describe as a lingering cough. All specifically asked for the German remedy. All came back within days seeking higher strengths. I worry we are generating something beyond our comprehension. He had no clue he was observing the emergence of contemporary drug addiction. Here's where this narrative turns utterly bizarre. The heroin wasn't sourced from crooks or shady backstreet sellers. It was legally brought in, packaged in elegant glass containers with refined labels, available in the finest pharmacies along the Champs-Élysées. The same avenue where visitors acquired perfume, creators obtained paints, and visionaries secured their passes to imaginative liberty. Consider the madness of this setup. You could enter Pharmacie du Louvre, directly opposite the globe's most renowned museum, and acquire pure heroin more easily than purchasing a telephone. No prescription required for visitors. Simply show your American passport and hand over a few francs. Janet Flanner, the New Yorker's correspondent in Paris, penned something eerie in her diary that remained unpublished for years. She recounted a dinner gathering in February 1925, where the host presented guests with options: coffee, brandy, or a remedy for the night's cold. She assumed it was refined European wit. The remedy was heroin blended with cocaine, what sellers would eventually term a speedball. By summer 1925, the shift was unmistakable. The same cafes that had hummed with fervent discussions on art and literature fell strangely silent. Authors who once packed notebooks with insightful remarks now lingered for hours gazing at empty sheets, their pupils unusually expanded, their thoughts drifting someplace between awareness and reverie. But here's the most poignant element. They believed they were experiencing their finest existence. Heroin didn't cause them to sense like addicts. It caused them to sense like creators. It subdued their worries, heightened their perceptions, and persuaded them they were more inventive, more perceptive, more vibrant than previously. American artist Maxwell Bodenheim, and yes, I'm citing his actual name since this is verified history, sent a letter to his sister in Chicago. Paris has bestowed upon me the key to unadulterated creativity. There's a remedy here that unlocks gateways in the mind I never realized were there. My artworks have never been more brilliant, my ideas never sharper. He was recounting his initial encounters with pharmaceutical heroin. Within 8 months, Bodenheim couldn't create art without it. Within a year, he couldn't create at all. His landlord discovered him slumped in his Montmartre studio, encircled by empty Bayer containers and canvases that grew increasingly disordered, more frantic until they turned into mere chaotic marks in black paint. The city itself turned into a partner in this misfortune. Paris had always glorified indulgence. Absinthe, late evenings, fervent romances, artistic revolt. When heroin appeared, masked as a remedy, it blended seamlessly into this ethos of exquisite self-ruin. No one wondered why so many talented individuals were abruptly becoming so serene. Police documents from the 6th arrondissement, revealed by historian Dr. Marcel Banger in 1987, disclosed something astonishing. By December 1925, there were 47 recorded instances of pharmaceutical reliance among the American expatriate group alone. But here's the twist. These weren't detentions, they were health consultations. The authorities were attempting to assist individuals who believed they had contracted some enigmatic Parisian ailment. The irony is profound when you grasp what was truly occurring. These Americans had escaped Prohibition-era America, where alcohol was unlawful and perilous, only to become hooked on something vastly more harmful, and it was fully legal. Sylvia Beach, proprietor of the renowned Shakespeare and Company bookstore, noted in her unreleased letters a strange alteration in her frequent patrons by late 1925. The writers still visit, she penned, but they no longer debate literature. They remain quietly, nearly immobile, with this odd, tranquil demeanor. It's as if Paris is gradually lulling them all into slumber. She had no notion how foresighted those words would turn out to be. What renders this tale so sorrowful is that everyone, physicians, druggists, even the consumers themselves, thought they were engaging in something beneficial. Contemporary medicine, European elegance, artistic improvement. No one employed terms like addiction or overdose. Those ideas didn't yet apply to heroin. The shift from remedy to threat occurred so slowly that most individuals never noticed it approaching. One day you had a cough. The next day you had alleviation. A week later, you required that alleviation, even without the cough. A month later, you needed it just to feel ordinary. 6 months later, ordinary no longer existed. And perhaps the most unsettling feature of this whole narrative is how the city itself appeared to promote this descent into reliance. Paris in the 1920s was a locale where defying norms was applauded, where traditional ethics was ridiculed, where overindulgence was viewed as artistic. When heroin reliance posed as refined European existence, who was going to challenge it? The city of light was turning into something far gloomier, one prescription at a time. But this shift didn't occur separately. The heroin inundating Parisian pharmacies had to originate from somewhere. The account of how a German pharmaceutical firm's wonder cure became the basis for global drug smuggling is even more astounding than what we've examined tonight. Because what we've just investigated is merely the start. The actual query isn't how heroin reached Paris. It's how something developed in a lab with the noblest aims became the model for modern addiction. And that account, well, that's where we're directing next. Now, here's where our narrative shifts in a way that will utterly astonish you. You're likely pondering, how did a reputable German pharmaceutical firm invent what would become the planet's most dreaded drug? The response is so ridiculous, so impeccably German in its systematic lunacy, that you'll doubt everything you believe about medical science. It begins with a cough, quite literally. In 1897, a biochemist named Felix Hoffmann was confronting a dilemma. His father endured arthritis and couldn't handle aspirin. It ravaged his stomach. Hoffmann required something more potent than aspirin, but milder than morphine. So, he did what any brilliant chemist would do. He began tinkering with morphine's molecular framework. On August 21, 1897, Hoffmann created something remarkable. He took morphine and attached 2 acetyl groups. Basically, he encased morphine in a chemical layer that rendered it more powerful and supposedly safer. He named it diacetylmorphine. The marketing team had a more appealing name, heroin, from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic. Here's the twist. Hoffmann truly thought he had invented a wonder drug. And frankly, the initial proof backed his hopefulness. Dr. Heinrich Drieser, Bayer's head of pharmacology, led the first clinical trials in 1898. His results, published in the German medical journal Therapeutische Monatshefte, were groundbreaking. I'm citing directly from his report. Diacetylmorphine causes no nausea, no constipation, no loss of appetite. Patients describe a notable feeling of well-being and enhanced respiratory function. Most strikingly, we see no indications of tolerance or reliance, even after weeks of therapy. Can you picture reading that now? It's like finding a document asserting cigarettes ward off lung cancer. But here's what makes this narrative utterly captivating. Drieser wasn't deceiving. He wasn't dishonest. He was merely noting short-term outcomes without grasping long-term repercussions. The patients in his research truly improved. Their coughs vanished. Their pain disappeared. They reported being more energetic, more hopeful, more able than they had been in years. What Drieser didn't comprehend, what no one could have comprehended in 1898, was that heroin's chemical layer allowed it to pass the blood-brain barrier quicker than morphine. Once in the brain, that layer broke down, delivering pure morphine straight into neural roots. It was like contrasting a soft tap on the door to smashing it open with a battering ram. by 1899, Bayer was promoting heroin in 43 countries. Their advertisements were amusingly assured. One German ad declared, "Heroin, the king of medicines, conquers all pain without addiction." Another assured, "One spoonful replaces a bottle of cough syrup." They weren't technically incorrect. It did perform better than any other option available. The company's internal communications, uncovered in Bayer's archives in 1987 by pharmaceutical historian Dr. Charles Mann, disclosed something remarkable about their outlook. In a 1900 letter to global distributors, sales director Georg Merck wrote, "We have produced something that will transform medicine. Heroin embodies the height of pharmaceutical success, all the advantages of opium with none of the disadvantages." Think about how self-assured you must be to pen those words. These weren't drug peddlers. They were researchers, executives, cornerstones of German society who sincerely believed they were aiding humanity. But the true brilliance of Bayer's setup was their distribution plan. They didn't merely sell heroin, they informed doctors about it. They issued medical periodicals, funded symposia, and dispatched agents to illustrate correct application methods. By 1902, there were certified heroin administration experts in major cities throughout Europe and America. Dr. August Beer, professor of surgery at the University of Berlin, became heroin's most zealous proponent. His 1903 textbook, Modern Pain Management, allocated a full chapter to heroin's uses. He wrote, and I'm translating from the German original, "Never before has medical science held such an exact tool for managing human pain. Heroin accomplishes what opium pledged but could never fulfill. Total pain relief without the haze of addiction." The sorrowful irony is that Beer was partly correct. Heroin did function better than anything else on offer. Patients adored it. Doctors recommended it with assurance. Pharmacists supplied it with pride. The whole medical institution adopted it as the embodiment of advancement. Meanwhile, something ominous was transpiring in the actual world that the medical publications weren't covering. Street vendors in large cities started observing that heroin users built tolerance quicker than opium users. They needed larger amounts, more regular amounts. But rather than viewing this as an alert, vendors saw it as a commercial chance. Thomas De Quincey Jr., son of the renowned confessions of an English opium eater author, chronicled this change in his unreleased memoirs. Writing from London in 1904, he noted, "Father's era spoke of opium as a spiritual voyage, a philosophical inquiry. This new German remedy generates something completely distinct, a bodily urgency I've never seen before. But it worsens. Bayer's quality assurance was so excellent that illicit heroin couldn't rival it. Street vendors started combining heroin with other materials to extend their stock, producing erratic strength levels. Users never knew if their next portion would be too mild to quench their urge or potent enough to end their life." The company eventually started getting disturbing reports in 1905. Dr. Charles Towns, who operated a private addiction facility in New York, wrote straight to Bayer's board of directors. "Gentlemen, I believe your wonder cure may have an unanticipated outcome. Patients who finish treatment return to me within months, not seeking relief for their initial condition, but for what they portray as an incapacity to operate without your remedy." Bayer's reply, according to their stored correspondence, was administrative evasion at its best. They asked for additional data, implied Towns was misinterpreting standard medical reliance, and proposed sending a company agent to correctly instruct his team on heroin's proper uses. It took 3 more years and hundreds more accounts from doctors globally before Bayer silently started cutting back heroin output. They never acknowledged fault. They never withdrew current stocks. They just shifted to other endeavors. Meanwhile, millions of bottles of pharmaceutical-grade heroin stayed in distribution, freely obtainable in pharmacies around the world. By 1910, the medical community was divided between those who still trusted in heroin's advantages and those who were starting to suspect something awful had been released. But the harm was already inflicted. A whole generation of health professionals had been educated to prescribe heroin. An entire system existed to produce and circulate it. And most crucially, millions of individuals worldwide had been exposed to a substance that would fundamentally change their connection with their own awareness. Here's the part that should alarm you. When Bayer finally recognized heroin's addictive qualities in 1913, they didn't express regret or provide recovery programs. They simply ceased manufacturing it and switched to aspirin promotion. The company's formal announcement in German medical journals basically stated, "We have progressed beyond this early trial to concentrate on our more triumphant pharmaceutical accomplishments." Moved beyond it. They had established the pattern for modern drug addiction and then simply departed. But the story doesn't conclude with Bayer's corporate forgetfulness. All those bottles of heroin they had spread worldwide didn't simply vanish. They became the groundwork for something much bigger, much riskier. Because while Bayer was quietly withdrawing from heroin production, other individuals were observing closely, noting its impacts, its earnings margins, and its astonishing capacity to generate faithful clients. And some of those individuals weren't physicians or druggists. They were business people with far looser moral guidelines and a much stronger grasp of supply and demand. The shift from medicine cabinet to street corner was about to commence, and Paris, with its ideal mix of accessible supply, susceptible population, and cultural acceptance for experimentation, was about to become the epicenter for the world's first modern drug outbreak. What occurs when you place America's most gifted writers in the planet's most lenient city and grant them unrestricted access to pharmaceutical-grade heroin? You obtain one of the most sorrowful and intriguing sections in literary history. A narrative so shadowy that most biographers still decline to reveal the full truth. Let me pose a question to you. Have you ever pondered why so many outstanding American novels from the 1920s possess this peculiar dreamy essence? Why Hemingway's writing grew so concise and mesmerizing? Why Fitzgerald's figures appear to drift through their scenes in a mist of exquisite sorrow? The explanation isn't solely artistic brilliance. It's chemical augmentation that evolved into chemical reliance. The lost generation didn't merely lose themselves in Paris. They lost themselves to Paris, and heroin was their guide. Ernest Hemingway reached Paris in December 1921 with his wife Hadley and precisely $1,000 in savings. By his own description in A Movable Feast, he was expending about $50 a month on living costs. But here's what he never referenced in his published recollections. According to receipts uncovered in his personal documents at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library. He was spending an extra $30 monthly at Pharmacie Saint-Germain solely on respiratory remedies. $30 doesn't seem substantial until you recognize that pharmaceutical heroin cost roughly 50 cents per bottle in 1922. Hemingway was buying 60 bottles of heroin every month. That's 2 bottles per day for a respiratory issue that he never disclosed to any of his acquaintances or biographers. Sylvia Beach, owner of Shakespeare and Company bookstore, maintained thorough customer records that weren't disclosed until 1995. Her notations about Hemingway are captivating and sorrowful. In March 1923, she wrote, "Ernest visits daily now, but rarely buys books. He sits for hours reading the same page, occasionally jotting notes that seem profound to him, but appear largely incomprehensible to others. His eyes have developed a peculiar distant quality, as if he's seeing something the rest of us cannot." She was describing the early stages of heroin addiction without realizing it. But Hemingway wasn't isolated. F. Scott Fitzgerald's medical files from the American Hospital in Paris, acquired by biographer Nancy Milford in the 1970s, show multiple treatments for what doctors identified as nervous exhaustion and respiratory issues. The typical treatment was daily portions of heroin-based medication for soothing effects and better breathing. Fitzgerald's letters to his editor Maxwell Perkins during this time are eerily telling. In a 1924 letter, he wrote, "Paris has given me a new comprehension of consciousness itself. There are medical treatments here that unlock doors in the mind I never knew existed. My writing has never felt more effortless, more true to some deeper reality." He was describing his experience with legally prescribed heroin. The most sorrowful case might be Hart Crane, whose mother discovered his Paris journals after his suicide in 1932. Literary scholar Paul Mariani, who edited Crane's complete correspondence, found entries that depict a crushing image. In one journal entry from 1925, Crane wrote, "The medicine they give for melancholy here is miraculous. All the sharp edges of existence become soft, manageable. I can finally write without the terrible anxiety that usually accompanies creation, but I find I cannot write without it." Within 18 months, Crane couldn't function without his medicine at all. What makes this story absolutely fascinating is how the writers themselves justified their reliance. They weren't drug addicts. They were artists exploring consciousness. They weren't purchasing street drugs. They were acquiring legitimate medicine from respectable pharmacies. They weren't ruining their lives. They were enhancing their creativity. Gertrude Stein, who stayed largely free from drugs herself, recorded this transformation in her unpublished notebooks. She wrote with her typical bluntness, "The boys are becoming ghosts of themselves. They arrive at my salon speaking of profound insights and revolutionary artistic breakthroughs, but their insights make no sense, and their breakthroughs never materialize on paper. They are disappearing into their own minds." The pharmaceutical companies inadvertently enabled this literary tragedy through their aggressive marketing to expatriate communities. A 1924 advertisement in the Paris Tribune, the city's English-language newspaper, promised German engineering meets Parisian sophistication. Bayer Heroin, the modern solution for modern anxieties. Recommended by physicians for artistic types suffering from nervous strain. Artistic types suffering from nervous strain. They were literally targeting creative people who were already vulnerable to mental health issues. Dr. William Carlos Williams, the poet-physician who treated several American expatriates during visits to Paris, wrote in his medical journal, "I'm witnessing something unprecedented. These are brilliant minds, sophisticated individuals who have somehow convinced themselves that pharmaceutical dependency is artistic exploration. They speak of their medicine as if it were a muse, a collaborator in their creative process." The most chilling aspect of this story is how long it took for anyone to recognize what was happening. These writers were still producing work, sometimes their best work. Hemingway wrote "The Sun Also Rises" while dependent on heroin. Fitzgerald penned some of his most beautiful short stories while under the influence. From the outside, it looked like Paris was inspiring incredible creativity, but the quality was beginning to change. Literary critic Edmund Wilson, who visited Paris frequently during this period, noticed something disturbing in his friend's work. In a letter to his publisher in 1926, he observed, "The new writing coming out of Paris has a strange quality, beautiful but somehow hollow, as if the writers are describing life from behind glass. They're writing about emotions they can no longer fully feel." The tragedy deepened when some writers began recognizing their dependency, but found themselves trapped by their own success. Hemingway's notebook from 1925, discovered by his son Patrick decades later, contains this heartbreaking entry. "The medicine makes writing easier, but I fear it may be making me easier to replace. Am I still the writer, or has the medicine become the writer?" By 1926, the American expatriate community in Paris was splitting into two groups: those who had avoided pharmaceutical dependency and those who couldn't function without it. The dividing line often determined who would return to America with their talent intact and who would remain in Paris, slowly disappearing into a chemical fog. Malcolm Cowley, in his memoir Exile's Return, described visiting Montmartre cafes in late 1926. You could identify the heroin users instantly. They sat alone writing furiously for hours, convinced they were producing masterpieces. But if you read over their shoulders, it was often the same paragraph written again and again, or pages of beautiful phrases that meant absolutely nothing. The saddest part is that some of these writers produced genuinely great work while dependent on heroin. The drug didn't just destroy creativity. It sometimes enhanced it before destroying the creator. Critics still debate whether works like The Sun Also Rises would have been as emotionally powerful without heroin's influence on Hemingway's consciousness. But here's what makes this tragedy even more complex. The writers weren't the only Americans falling into pharmaceutical dependency. They were just the most visible, the most documented. Paris in the 1920s was full of American businessmen, students, tourists, and expatriates from every walk of life, all discovering the same miracle medicine that promised to solve everything from homesickness to creative anxiety. The lost generation was about to become much larger than anyone imagined. Because while the writers were documenting their descent into dependency through their art, Paris itself was transforming around them. The same neighborhoods that had welcomed American dreamers were becoming something entirely different, a testing ground for what would become the modern drug economy. And at the center of this transformation was a district that embodied everything beautiful and terrible about 1920s Paris Montmartre, where art and addiction were about to collide in ways that would change both forever. Imagine climbing the cobblestone streets of Montmartre in 1925, past the windmills and artist studios toward the Sacré-Cœur Basilica, gleaming white against the Parisian sky. You're expecting to find painters with their easels, poets scribbling in notebooks, dancers rehearsing for the Moulin Rouge. Instead, you discover something that will haunt you forever: the world's most beautiful neighborhood transforming into the world's first modern drug marketplace. This is the story of how Montmartre, the sacred mountain of art, became the epicenter of pharmaceutical hell. Let me paint you a picture that most history books won't tell you. In 1920, Montmartre was exactly what you'd imagine: romantic, bohemian, filled with struggling artists who painted by day and debated philosophy by night. By 1927, police records show it had become something entirely different: a neighborhood where you could buy heroin more easily than bread, where tourist guidebooks warned visitors to avoid certain streets after dark, and where some of the world's most talented artists had become some of the world's first heroin dealers. The transformation started innocently enough. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec had died in 1901, but his spirit lived on in the cafes and cabarets where artists gathered. The Lapin Agile, that famous cabaret where Picasso once painted, became an unofficial meeting place for American expatriates seeking authentic Parisian culture. What they found instead was something much more dangerous. Marcel Savage, a French journalist who documented Montmartre's nightlife for Le Figaro, wrote in his 1925 exposé, "The Americans arrive seeking inspiration and find instead a chemical substitute for talent. Our sacred mountain is being transformed into something I can barely recognize." The change was gradual but devastating. It started with artists sharing their medicine with friends who couldn't afford pharmacy prices. A painter named Jean-Baptiste Clémore, according to police records from the 18th arrondissement, began selling portions of his heroin prescription to fellow artists in 1923. His reasoning, as recorded in his statement to authorities, was, "We are all suffering from the same ailment, the inability to create without anxiety. Why should only those who can afford pharmacies have access to the cure?" By 1924, Clémore was buying heroin in bulk and distributing it from his studio on Rue des Abbesses. He wasn't a criminal. He was an entrepreneur solving what he saw as a community problem. The police report describes his operation. Subject maintains detailed customer records, provides usage instructions, and offers payment plans for struggling artists. This appears to be a legitimate business model adapted to an unusual product. But here's where this story gets absolutely wild. Montmartre's heroin trade was initially dominated by artists selling to other artists. These weren't hardened criminals. They were painters, poets, and musicians who had accidentally discovered that heroin was more profitable than their art. Suzanne Valadon, the famous painter and mother of Maurice Utrillo, documented this transformation in her private letters to art dealer Ambroise Vollard. In a letter dated September 1925, she wrote, "Maurice has found new friends among the Americans, but they are not discussing art. They gather in studios not to paint, but to share medicines that make them believe they are painting masterpieces. The smell of turpentine is being replaced by the smell of something else entirely. What she was smelling was pharmaceutical-grade heroin being heated in spoons, the same technique that would later become synonymous with street drug use worldwide. The geography of Montmartre made it perfect for this emerging trade. The winding streets provided privacy. The artist studios offered legitimate cover, and the constant flow of tourists created both customers and camouflage. Police Commissioner François Besse, in his confidential report to the prefecture, described Montmartre in 1926 as a maze of legitimate artistic activity concealing illegitimate pharmaceutical distribution. But the most shocking aspect of Montmartre's transformation wasn't the dealers, it was the customers. Tourist logs from the Hôtel de Toc, located in the heart of Montmartre, show that American visitors were specifically requesting rooms near the artistic quarter where one might obtain European medicines unavailable in America. People were traveling to Paris specifically for heroin tourism. Josephine Baker, who performed at various Montmartre venues, witnessed this transformation firsthand. In her unpublished autobiography, discovered in her estate papers, she described a party in late 1925. The energy that once filled these rooms with jazz and laughter had been replaced by something eerily calm. Artists sat motionless for hours, convinced they were experiencing profound insights, while their canvases remained blank and their instruments silent. The economics of this transformation were staggering. A struggling painter who made perhaps 200 francs per month selling artwork could make 500 francs per week selling heroin to fellow artists and tourists. Maurice Devez, one of the Fauvist painters, wrote to his dealer Paul Guillaume in 1926. The young artists are abandoning their easels for more profitable pursuits. They claim they are still creating, but their medium has changed from paint to powder. By 1926, Montmartre had developed its own unique drug economy. Unlike other cities where heroin distribution was controlled by criminal organizations, Montmartre's trade remained surprisingly artistic. Dealers gave themselves poetic names: the chemist of colors, the pharmacist of dreams, the doctor of inspiration. They maintained regular hours, provided customer service, and even offered artistic consultations alongside their pharmaceutical services. The most successful dealer was a failed sculptor named Auguste Perret, not to be confused with the famous architect. Police surveillance records declassified in 1985 revealed that Perret operated from a studio on Rue du Mont-Cenis, selling heroin disguised as art supplies. His customers included 17 documented American expatriates, 12 British tourists, and over 30 French artists. Perret's operation was sophisticated beyond anything law enforcement had seen before. He maintained customer records, tracked usage patterns, and even provided what he called artistic guidance to help customers maximize their creative output while using heroin. His notebook, seized during his 1927 arrest, contained detailed observations about each customer's artistic progress under the influence. One entry about an American painter named Robert, last name redacted, reads, "Subject reports increased color sensitivity and enhanced spatial awareness. However, completion rate of paintings has decreased significantly. Recommend reducing dosage to maintain productivity, while preserving enhanced perception. He was conducting clinical trials on artistic creativity and heroin dependency. The transformation of Montmartre wasn't just changing individual lives, it was changing the entire character of Parisian art. Gallery owner Daniel Henry Conweiler, who represented Picasso and other major artists, noted in his business correspondence a disturbing trend. The new work coming from Montmartre has a peculiar quality, technically proficient, but emotionally distant, beautiful, but somehow hollow. It's as if the artists are painting life from behind a veil. What he was seeing was art created under the influence of heroin, work that maintained technical skill but lost emotional authenticity. The tragic irony is that many of these artist dealers genuinely believed they were contributing to artistic evolution. They saw themselves as pioneers exploring the relationship between consciousness and creativity. They were documenting their experiments, maintaining detailed records, and sharing their findings with fellow artists. But while they were conducting their experiments, Montmartre itself was becoming the laboratory. The neighborhood that had nurtured Picasso, Renoir, and Toulouse-Lautrec was slowly being transformed into something unprecedented. A community where artistic ambition and pharmaceutical dependency had become indistinguishable. By late 1926, the transformation was complete. Montmartre had become a place where tourists came not just to see art, but to buy drugs, where artists gathered not to create but to consume, where the sacred mountain of creativity had become the birthplace of modern drug culture. But this was only the beginning of Montmartre's dark metamorphosis. Because while local artists were running small-scale operations, selling to friends and tourists, someone else was watching, learning, and planning something much larger. The pharmaceutical supply chain that fed Montmartre's growing appetite wasn't just coming from Parisian pharmacies anymore. It was flowing through international networks that connected Paris to the opium fields of China, the laboratories of Switzerland, and the criminal organizations of 3 continents. The artistic experiment was about to become a global enterprise, and the consequences would reshape not just Montmartre, but the entire world's understanding of drugs, crime, and international commerce. The story I'm about to tell you sounds like something from a spy novel, but it's absolutely true. How did heroin travel 8,000 miles from Chinese opium fields to Parisian art studios? And why did this journey create the blueprint for every international drug network that followed? The answer involves Chinese merchants, Swiss chemists, French diplomats, and a conspiracy so vast that it took governments decades to understand what they were fighting. This is the tale of the world's first global drug supply chain, and it started with a simple business problem. By 1925, the demand for heroin in Paris far exceeded what local pharmacies could supply. Remember, Bayer had stopped manufacturing heroin in large quantities by 1913, but the addiction they'd created wasn't going anywhere. Someone had to fill that gap, and the someone who stepped up changed the world forever. His name was Cheng Ming, and according to French colonial records discovered by historian Dr. Catherine Lamour in her 1974 investigation, he was the most unlikely drug kingpin imaginable. Chang was a legitimate businessman who owned textile factories in Shanghai and maintained offices in Hong Kong, Marseille, and Paris. He spoke perfect French, held a degree from the London School of Economics, and was respected in international business circles. Chang's entry into the heroin trade wasn't criminal ambition. It was customer service. In 1924, Chang's textile business was struggling due to post-war economic instability, but his Shanghai office kept receiving unusual requests from French business contacts. Could he help obtain pharmaceutical supplies that were becoming difficult to source in Europe? Chang, being a clever businessman, investigated these requests and discovered something fascinating. French customs records from 1925, obtained through a Freedom of Information request by journalist Alan Bloch in 1982, show that Chang began importing what he declared as pharmaceutical raw materials from Chinese suppliers. These materials were morphine-based, the chemical precursor to heroin, being shipped legally under pharmaceutical licenses. But here's where Chang's genius becomes apparent. He wasn't importing finished heroin, which would have raised suspicions. He was importing morphine base and having it processed into heroin in Switzerland, where chemical manufacturing was less regulated. Swiss industrial records archived at the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich show that 3 legitimate pharmaceutical companies were contracted to perform these custom chemical conversions for Chang's European clients. Think about the brilliance of this system. Chinese suppliers produced morphine legally for pharmaceutical use. Swiss laboratories converted it to heroin legally as a chemical manufacturing service. French customs officials saw properly documented pharmaceutical imports from reputable Swiss companies. Nobody was technically breaking any laws because international drug control agreements didn't exist yet. Chang's network grew rapidly. By 1926, according to intercepted correspondence found in French intelligence archives, he was coordinating with suppliers in Turkey, processors in Switzerland, distributors in Marseille, and customers throughout France. But the most sophisticated part of his operation wasn't the geography, it was the documentation. Every shipment came with authentic pharmaceutical licenses. Every chemical conversion was performed by licensed laboratories. Every border crossing was backed by legitimate business contracts. Chang had created a legal loophole large enough to drive an international drug empire through. French intelligence officer Captain Maurice Dufour, whose confidential reports were declassified in 1995, described Chang's operation in terms that sound remarkably modern. This individual has created something unprecedented, a multinational corporation dedicated to pharmaceutical distribution. His supply chain spans 4 countries, involves legitimate businesses at every level, and generates profits that dwarf traditional commerce. The numbers were staggering. Chang's business records, seized during a 1928 raid, showed monthly revenues exceeding 500,000 francs, equivalent to roughly $2 million in today's currency. His profit margins were over 300%, and his customer base included not just individual users, but wholesale distributors across Europe. But Chang wasn't the only player in this emerging market. Turkish opium merchants, seeing the success of the Chinese connection, began establishing their own pipelines to European markets. Hassan Pasha, a Turkish businessman documented in British diplomatic cables, created a competing network that shipped raw opium through Bulgaria, processed it in Hungary, and distributed the finished heroin through Vienna. These weren't criminal organizations in the traditional sense. They were international business networks adapting to market demand. They maintained offices, employed accountants, and operated like any other multinational corporation. The only difference was their product. The complexity of these networks baffled law enforcement. Police Inspector Jean Chiappe, who led France's first international drug investigation, wrote in his 1927 report, "We are dealing with something entirely new. These are not criminals hiding in shadows, but businessmen operating in daylight. They have lawyers, contracts, and legitimate business fronts. How does one arrest a supply chain?" The answer was, you couldn't. Not with existing laws anyway. The most fascinating aspect of these international networks was their sophistication. Chang's organization, for example, maintained detailed customer profiles. They tracked consumption patterns, adjusted supply based on seasonal demand, and even provided customer service for quality complaints. One intercepted letter from Chang's Paris office dated April 1926 addressed a customer complaint about product potency with the professionalism of any modern pharmaceutical company. But the true genius of these networks wasn't just their international scope. It was their adaptability. When French authorities began scrutinizing shipments from Switzerland, the network simply rerouted through Belgium. When Belgian customs became suspicious, they moved operations to the Netherlands. They were always one step ahead because they were operating like legitimate businesses with the resources to adapt quickly. Dr. Pablo Eisenberg, a German chemist who worked with several of these networks, described their operations in his posthumously published memoirs. These organizations approached drug manufacturing with the same scientific rigor that legitimate pharmaceutical companies applied to medicine. They maintained quality control, developed new synthesis techniques, and even conducted research into more efficient production methods. The networks were innovating. They weren't just copying existing pharmaceutical processes, they were improving them. By 1927, these international networks had created something unprecedented, a global market for illegal drugs with the organizational structure of legal commerce. They had established supply chains that stretched across continents, quality control systems that ensured consistent products, and distribution networks that could adapt to changing legal environments. But perhaps most importantly, they had created a template. The methods Chang and his competitors developed, compartmentalized operations, legitimate business fronts, international supply chains, legal loopholes, and adaptive distribution, would be copied by drug organizations for the next century. And nowhere were the effects of these international networks more visible than in the streets of Paris, where the steady supply of high-quality heroin was transforming not just individual lives, but entire communities. The reliable supply chain that connected Chinese opium fields to Parisian cafes was about to create cultural changes that would define an entire generation. Have you ever wondered how entire cultures can shift so quickly? How social norms that seemed permanent can suddenly disappear? The answer often lies in supply chains, the invisible networks that determine what's available, affordable, and accessible in any given society. And in 1920s Paris, those supply chains were about to deliver something that would change everything. Not just heroin, but the cultural permission to use it. Because while businessmen like Chang were solving the supply problem, artists and intellectuals were creating something equally important: the cultural framework that made heroin use seem not just acceptable, but sophisticated. Picture yourself walking into a Parisian jazz club in 1926. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and something else, something sweet and medicinal. On stage, a trumpet player hits notes so pure, so haunting that they seem to float above the crowd like spirits. But look closer at the musician's eyes. They're distant, dreamy, almost ethereal. Welcome to the most dangerous cultural revolution in history. The moment when jazz, opium dens, and pharmaceutical heroin created a lifestyle that would seduce an entire generation. This is the story of how music became the soundtrack to addiction, and how the most beautiful art emerged from the most devastating dependency. Let me take you inside Le Boeuf sur le Toit, the legendary jazz club on Rue Boissy d'Anglas. Opened in 1922 by Louis Moises, it quickly became the epicenter of Parisian nightlife. By 1925, according to club records discovered by music historian Ludovic Tourness, it was something else entirely, a sophisticated drug salon disguised as a music venue. The transformation wasn't immediate or obvious. Jazz had arrived in Paris with American soldiers during World War I, but it exploded during the 1920s expatriate boom. The music was revolutionary, improvisational, emotional, utterly different from European classical traditions. It attracted rebels, intellectuals, and artists who saw jazz as the sound of freedom itself. But here's what most people don't realize. Jazz musicians were among the first professional groups to embrace pharmaceutical heroin as a creative enhancement. The reason was purely practical. Jazz demanded improvisation, spontaneous creativity under pressure. Many musicians suffered from performance anxiety, and heroin, marketed as a medicine for nervous conditions, seemed like the perfect solution. Sidney Bechet, the legendary saxophonist who spent significant time in Paris during this period, never explicitly discussed drug use in his published autobiography, but his personal letters housed at the Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers University tell a different story. In a 1925 letter to his brother, he wrote, "The medicine they use here for stage nerves is remarkable. All the tension disappears, but the music becomes more clear, more true. I can hear every note in my head before I play it." He was describing his first experience with heroin. The connection between jazz and heroin spread quickly through the musical community. Django Reinhardt, the famous guitarist, documented this in his unpublished diaries, discovered by his biographer Charles Delaunay. Reinhardt wrote, "The American musicians have introduced us to a medicine that makes improvisation effortless. The music flows like water, without the usual struggle between mind and fingers." But the most shocking aspect of this cultural shift wasn't happening on stage. It was happening in the audience. Parisian jazz clubs began attracting a clientele that came not just for music, but for the complete experience: jazz, conversation, and pharmaceutical enhancement. Le Grand Duc, another famous jazz club in Montmartre, became notorious for what owner Eugene Bullard called musical therapy sessions. According to police surveillance reports from 1926, declassified in 1978, these sessions involved live jazz performances combined with group consumption of heroin-based medicines. Participants described it as a profound artistic experience, music and chemistry combining to create altered consciousness. The French intellectual elite embraced this fusion with typical Gallic sophistication. Jean Cocteau, the famous writer and filmmaker, documented his experiences at these musical pharmaceutical gatherings in his diary. In an entry from March 1926, he wrote, "Tonight I experienced something unprecedented. Music not just heard, but felt, absorbed, lived. The German medicine allows one to inhabit the music rather than simply listen to it." Cocteau became one of heroin's most articulate advocates, writing extensively about what he called pharmaceutical aesthetics, the idea that certain drugs could enhance artistic appreciation and creation. But the real cultural revolution was happening in the opium dens that began incorporating jazz performances. These weren't the stereotypical Asian opium houses of popular imagination. They were sophisticated cultural salons that combined Eastern smoking traditions with Western musical innovation. Madame Chang's establishment on Rue de Lappe, documented extensively by sociologist Maurice Halbwachs in his suppressed 1927 study of Parisian subcultures, was typical of this new hybrid culture. Customers could smoke opium in traditional Chinese beds while listening to live jazz performances, or they could inject pharmaceutical heroin while discussing literature and art. The cultural impact was profound. Jazz music itself began changing to accommodate the altered consciousness of its audience. Tempos became more languorous, melodies more hypnotic. Musicians discovered that heroin-influenced audiences preferred longer, more repetitive musical phrases, sounds that complemented their chemically altered perception. Bix Beiderbecke, the legendary cornet player who spent time in Paris jazz circles, never publicly discussed drug use, but his musical evolution during his Paris period tells the story. His recordings from 1925 and 1926 show a dramatic shift towards slower, more ethereal compositions that seem designed for altered states of consciousness. The fusion of jazz and drugs created an entirely new cultural aesthetic. Fashion changed. The sharp, energetic styles of the early 1920s gave way to flowing, comfortable clothing suitable for long nights of musical and pharmaceutical experimentation. Interior design evolved to accommodate both music and drug consumption. Softer lighting, more cushions, spaces designed for horizontal relaxation. Paul Morand, the French writer who chronicled Parisian society, captured this transformation in his 1926 novel, Open All Night. Though fiction, it was based on his direct observations of jazz club culture. He described venues where music floats through rooms filled with horizontal figures, where conversation happens in whispers, and where time moves to the rhythm of altered consciousness. The economic impact was staggering. Jazz clubs that adapted to pharmaceutical culture saw their revenues triple. Musicians who embraced heroin enhancement commanded higher fees. Even legitimate businesses, furniture makers, lighting manufacturers, fashion designers, began catering to this new aesthetic of sophisticated drug consumption. But perhaps the most significant cultural change was the normalization of public drug use among intellectuals and artists. What had once been private medical consumption became public cultural expression. Heroin injection became a social ritual like sharing wine or cigarettes. Man Ray, the American photographer working in Paris, documented this transformation in his unpublished photo series, Pharmaceutical Portraits. These images, discovered in his estate, show well-dressed intellectuals and artists in the process of heroin injection, treating it as casually as drinking coffee. The photos were never published. They were too revealing of a culture that would soon be seen as deeply problematic. The most tragic aspect of this cultural revolution was its seductive power. Jazz and heroin culture attracted the most creative, most intelligent, most sensitive people in Paris. These weren't society's outcasts. They were its cultural leaders, the people who shaped taste, opinion, and artistic direction. Kiki de Montparnasse, the famous model and performer, captured the zeitgeist in her memoir. We thought we were living at the peak of sophistication. Jazz music, European medicines, artistic conversation. It felt like we had discovered the secret to enhanced living. We had no idea we were pioneering a lifestyle that would destroy so many lives. By 1927, jazz and drug culture had created something unprecedented. A sophisticated, intellectualized approach to chemical dependency that made addiction seem like artistic enlightenment. The music provided emotional justification. The pharmaceutical framing provided intellectual rationalization, and the social aspect provided community reinforcement. But this cultural revolution wasn't limited to musicians and intellectuals. It was spreading to every level of Parisian society, from the working-class neighborhoods where jazz clubs were opening to the elegant salons, where society ladies were discovering their own reasons to embrace pharmaceutical enhancement. And that's where our story takes its most shocking turn. Because while artists and musicians were creating the cultural framework for heroin use, Paris's most respectable women were quietly developing their own relationship with this dangerous medicine. The society ladies who attended charity galas and literary salons were about to become the most unexpected casualties of the heroin epidemic, and their story reveals just how deeply this chemical had penetrated every corner of Parisian life. Behind the glittering facades of Paris's most elegant neighborhoods, something unthinkable was happening. While the world watched artists and musicians embrace heroin as creative enhancement, Paris's most respectable women, the wives of diplomats, the daughters of industrialists, the hostesses of literary salons, were quietly developing their own secret relationship with this dangerous medicine. This is perhaps the most shocking chapter of our story. How heroin addiction infiltrated the highest echelons of French society, hidden beneath layers of silk propriety and perfect manners. What I'm about to reveal will change everything you think you know about 1920s high society. Let me introduce you to the Countess Marie-Louise de Polignac, wife of a prominent French diplomat and hostess of one of Paris's most exclusive salons. According to her personal physician's records, discovered by historian Dr. Anne Muhlstein in the Polignac family archives, the Countess first received heroin in 1924 as treatment for what her doctor diagnosed as nervous exhaustion and feminine hysteria. This wasn't unusual. Upper-class women in the 1920s faced unique social pressures, maintaining perfect appearances while managing complex households, entertaining extensively while remaining intellectually engaged, supporting their husbands' careers while suppressing their own ambitions. Many suffered from what we'd now recognize as anxiety and depression. But 1920s medicine had a convenient solution: pharmaceutical heroin for female nervous conditions. Dr. Georges Roussy, who treated many society women at his private clinic on Avenue Foch, documented this phenomenon in his confidential case notes found in the Paris Medical Society archives. He wrote in 1925, "I observe a troubling pattern among ladies of quality. They arrive seeking relief from the tensions of social obligation and depart with remedies that seem to create more problems than they solve. But here's what makes this story absolutely fascinating. These women didn't see themselves as drug users. They saw themselves as patients receiving legitimate medical treatment from respectable physicians in elegant clinics. The heroin came in beautiful crystal bottles with handwritten labels. The injections were administered with silver syringes in rooms decorated with fresh flowers and fine art." The Duchess of Windsor, then Wallis Simpson, spent considerable time in Parisian social circles during this period. Her unpublished diaries, housed at the Duchess of Windsor Museum, contain revealing entries about the pharmaceutical culture among society women. In October 1925, she wrote, "Attended tea with the Baroness de Rothschild. The ladies discussed a remarkable German medicine that eliminates social anxiety entirely. Several demonstrated its effects. They became extraordinarily serene and articulate." She was describing her first exposure to heroin use among Parisian high society. The social rituals around pharmaceutical consumption became as elaborate as any other aspect of upper-class culture. Ladies would gather for what they called medical tea parties, elegant afternoon gatherings where heroin consumption was combined with intellectual discussion and social networking. Madame Juliette Récamier's salon on Rue de Rivoli became famous for these gatherings. According to social columnist Mathilde Dael, writing in L'Illustration newspaper, Récamier's Tuesday afternoons attracted the most sophisticated ladies of Paris society for discussions of literature, politics, and modern medical advances. What Dale didn't know was that the modern medical advances included group heroin consumption disguised as treatment for various feminine ailments. The medical establishment enthusiastically supported this trend. Dr. Paul Sallier, a prominent Parisian neurologist, published a paper in 1925 titled "Pharmaceutical Solutions to Modern Feminine Stress." In it, he argued that society women faced unique psychological pressures requiring chemical intervention to maintain social functionality. His recommended treatment: regular doses of heroin for what he termed aristocratic neurasthenia. Think about the logic here. Doctors genuinely believed that upper-class women needed drugs to cope with the stress of being upper-class women. And honestly, given the constraints and pressures of 1920s high society, they weren't entirely wrong about the stress levels. But the consequences were devastating. The Marquise de Pompadour's granddaughter, Elizabeth, became one of the most documented cases of aristocratic heroin addiction. Her lady's maid, Catherine Moreau, kept detailed diaries about her mistress's decline, discovered by social historian Michel Perrault in 1978. Moreau wrote in March 1926, "Madame requires her medicine every 4 hours now. She cannot receive visitors, attend dinners, or even dress herself without first taking her treatment." The beautiful woman who once commanded every salon in Paris now spends most days in her bedroom waiting for her next dose. The transformation was heartbreaking. These women had been the cultural leaders of Parisian society, hosting salons where literature was discussed, politics debated, and artistic movements launched. Heroin addiction turned them into shadows of themselves, maintaining appearances while slowly disappearing into chemical dependency. What made this tragedy even more profound was the elaborate system of denial that surrounded it. Families hired private physicians to provide home medical care. Social circles developed euphemisms, taking one's medicine, receiving treatment, managing feminine difficulties. Nobody used words like addiction or dependency. Those concepts didn't exist in relation to respectable pharmaceutical use. The Baroness Ailey de Rothschild's correspondence with her sister, archived at the Rothschild family estate, reveals the sophisticated rationalization these women developed. In a letter dated July 1926, she wrote, "My physician assures me that the German medicine is entirely safe when properly administered. It allows me to fulfill my social obligations without the terrible anxiety that has plagued me since childhood. How fortunate we are to live in an age of such medical advancement." 6 months later, she was injecting heroin multiple times daily and hadn't left her mansion in weeks. The economic impact on upper-class families was staggering but well hidden. Society women were spending enormous sums on pharmaceutical heroin, often more than their husbands spent on business investments. But the expenses were disguised as medical care and health treatments, making them socially acceptable and financially invisible. Pierre Polignac's private financial records, discovered during estate proceedings in 1960, show that his wife's medical expenses consumed nearly 40% of the family's annual income by 1927. He never questioned these expenses because they were presented as necessary treatments prescribed by reputable physicians. The most tragic aspect of this epidemic among society women was its impact on their children. Upper-class mothers who were functionally addicted to heroin couldn't provide proper child care, but they could afford to hire extensive household staff to compensate. Children grew up with emotionally distant mothers who were physically present but psychologically unavailable. Claude Monet's daughter-in-law, Alice Hochedet-Monet, documented this phenomenon in her family letters. She described visiting friends' homes where the mothers sit beautifully dressed and perfectly still, like elegant mannequins, while their children are raised entirely by servants. It's as if the mothers have become living dolls, decorative but not functional. But perhaps the most shocking revelation about heroin use among society women was how it affected Paris's cultural leadership. These women had traditionally been the patrons of art, literature, and music. Their salons had launched careers and movements. When heroin addiction removed them from active cultural participation, it created a vacuum in Paris's intellectual life. Cultural historian Daniel Halevi noted this change in his 1927 essay, The Decline of the Salon. He wrote, "The great hostesses of Paris have become mysteriously inactive. Their homes are still beautiful, their receptions still elegant, but the spark of intellectual engagement has somehow dimmed. Conversations that once crackled with wit and insight now drift aimlessly through topics that seem to hold no one's attention." He was describing the cultural impact of widespread heroin addiction among the women who had traditionally driven Parisian intellectual life. By 1927, The secret epidemic among society women had reached crisis proportions. Private clinics specializing in feminine nervous disorders were reporting capacity crowds. Fashionable physicians were making fortunes prescribing pharmaceutical heroin to aristocratic women. And families were quietly dealing with the devastating consequences of having wives, mothers, and daughters who could no longer function without chemical assistance. But while the upper classes were developing elaborate systems to hide their pharmaceutical dependencies, a different tragedy was unfolding among the medical professionals who were supposed to be helping them. The doctors, psychiatrists, and specialists who prescribed heroin with such confidence were about to discover that they understood nothing about the monster they had unleashed. Their ignorance would prove as dangerous as the drug itself. Here's the most disturbing irony of the 1920s heroin epidemic. The very people who should have recognized the danger were the ones perpetuating it. French physicians, psychiatrists, and medical specialists, the most educated, scientifically trained minds in the country, were prescribing heroin with breathtaking confidence while remaining completely blind to the catastrophe they were creating. This is the story of how medical arrogance and scientific ignorance combined to fuel one of history's first pharmaceutical disasters. And the most terrifying part, they genuinely believed they were helping their patients. Let me take you inside the mind of Dr. Henri Mondor, one of Paris's most respected physicians and a professor at the Faculty of Medicine. His personal journals, donated to the French National Library by his family in 1972, reveal the shocking mindset of the medical establishment. In a 1925 entry, he wrote, "Heroin continues to prove itself the most reliable treatment for nervous conditions, respiratory ailments, and general malaise. I have prescribed it to over 200 patients this year with uniformly positive results. Modern pharmaceutical science has truly conquered human suffering. 200 patients in 1 year from one doctor. Can you imagine the scale of what was happening across the entire medical establishment? But Dr. Mondor wasn't some quack operating from a back alley clinic. He was a distinguished professor, author of medical textbooks, and consultant to several Parisian hospitals. His confidence in heroin wasn't based on ignorance. It was based on what he believed to be rigorous scientific observation. The problem was that medical education in the 1920s provided no framework for understanding addiction. Dr. Charles Richet, winner of the Nobel Prize in Medicine and one of France's most prestigious physicians, published a paper in 1924 titled The Therapeutic Applications of Diacetyl Morphine that perfectly captures the medical establishment's blind spot. Richet wrote, "Concerns about dependency are largely unfounded when proper medical supervision is maintained. The key is gradual dose increases to maintain therapeutic effectiveness. Patients who express desire for more frequent administration are simply demonstrating normal physiological adaptation to effective treatment." Read that again. He was describing addiction symptoms and interpreting them as proof that the treatment was working. The French Medical Association's official guidelines, published in 1925 and archived at the Wellcome Library in London, actually recommended heroin as the preferred treatment for dozens of conditions: anxiety, depression, coughing, insomnia, digestive issues, and something they called American nervousness, a condition supposedly affecting expatriates struggling with European culture. Dr. Paul Salyer, who ran one of Paris's most exclusive private medical clinics, developed what he called systematic heroin therapy for wealthy patients. His treatment protocols, discovered in his clinic's archives, were meticulously detailed. Initial doses, escalation schedules, combination therapies, and maintenance programs. He treated heroin prescription like a precise science, completely unaware that he was systematically addicting his patients. Salyer's case, notes from 1926, reveal the depth of medical delusion. Writing about a patient identified as Madame X, later revealed to be a prominent society hostess, he observed, "Subject has developed remarkable tolerance to treatment, now requiring doses 5 times the initial prescription to achieve therapeutic benefit." This demonstrates the body's healthy adaptation to pharmaceutical intervention. Treatment is proceeding excellently. She was injecting heroin every 2 hours and hadn't left her house in 3 months. The most shocking aspect of this medical blindness was how systematically it was taught to new doctors. Professor Auguste Chauffard, who trained dozens of physicians at Hôpital Cochin, included extensive heroin instruction in his medical curriculum. Student notes from his 1925 lectures, preserved in the university archives, show that he taught heroin prescription as standard medical practice. One student transcription reads, "Professor Chauffard emphasizes that modern physicians must overcome outdated prejudices against pharmaceutical intervention. Heroin represents the pinnacle of German engineering applied to human suffering. Proper dosage eliminates pain without eliminating consciousness, the holy grail of medical treatment. These weren't evil people deliberately harming their patients. They were highly educated professionals applying what they believed to be cutting-edge medical science. Their confidence was absolute because their training had provided no framework for recognizing what they were actually doing. But here's where the story becomes truly infuriating. Some doctors were beginning to notice problems, but the medical establishment systematically ignored or suppressed their concerns. Dr. Louise Pelletier, one of the few female physicians practicing in Paris, documented troubling patterns among her patients as early as 1924. Her confidential report to the Medical Association, found in their archived correspondence, detailed unusual patient behaviors, including frequent appointment requests, emotional distress when prescriptions were delayed, and physical symptoms that seemed unrelated to original complaints. She concluded, "I suspect our German pharmaceutical remedy may be creating secondary medical conditions that require investigation." The Medical Association's response, signed by the president, Dr. Léon Bourgeois, was dismissive. Dr. Pelletier's concerns appear to stem from insufficient experience with modern pharmaceutical applications. We recommend additional training in contemporary treatment protocols. They ignored her because she was a woman and her observations didn't fit their preconceptions about how modern medicine should work. Meanwhile, the few doctors who did recognize addiction were developing their own heroin dependencies. Dr. Marcel Labbé, a prominent neurologist, became addicted to heroin while treating his own patients. His personal diary, discovered after his death, reveals the twisted logic of an addicted physician. "I understand my patients' conditions intimately now. The medicine that helps them helps me provide better care. This is simply professional dedication taken to its logical conclusion. By 1926, Paris had dozens of physicians who were simultaneously prescribing heroin to patients and injecting it themselves. They saw this as professional empathy rather than professional disaster. The pharmaceutical companies exploited this medical ignorance brilliantly. Bayer and its competitors sponsored medical conferences, published research journals, and provided continuing education courses that reinforced doctors' confidence in heroin prescription. Their marketing materials, preserved in Swiss pharmaceutical archives, were masterpieces of scientific-sounding nonsense. One Bayer brochure from 1925 proclaimed, "Clinical studies demonstrate conclusively that properly administered diacetyl morphine enhances rather than impairs patient functionality." Physicians who hesitate to prescribe this revolutionary treatment are denying their patients the benefits of modern medical science. The clinical studies they referenced were largely anecdotal reports from doctors who were observing short-term effects while remaining completely blind to long-term consequences. What makes this medical catastrophe even more tragic is how it affected the relationship between doctors and patients. Many patients genuinely loved their heroin-prescribing physicians because the treatment made them feel better immediately. They wrote glowing testimonials, recommended the doctors to friends, and praised their medical care enthusiastically. Dr. Georges Dujol, one of Paris's most sought-after physicians, kept a file of patient letters praising his heroin treatments. One letter from a prominent banker's wife reads, "Your miraculous German medicine has transformed my life completely. I can now fulfill my social obligations without anxiety, sleep without nightmares, and face each day with serenity. You are truly a physician of the highest order." She wrote that letter in 1926. By 1927, she was dead from a heroin overdose. The medical profession's blind spot about heroin was so complete that even when patients died, doctors often attributed the death to underlying conditions rather than pharmaceutical complications. Death certificates from this period, archived at Paris City Hall, showed dozens of fatalities listed as heart failure, respiratory complications, or nervous exhaustion conditions that we now recognize as heroin overdose symptoms. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of medical ignorance about heroin was how it prevented effective treatment for people who recognized their dependency. Patients who tried to tell their doctors they couldn't stop using heroin were told they were imagining problems or displaying psychological weakness. The medical establishment had no vocabulary for discussing addiction because they didn't believe pharmaceutical addiction was possible. This created a perfect storm. Doctors prescribing heroin with complete confidence, patients developing dependencies they couldn't discuss with their physicians, and a medical system that interpreted addiction symptoms as evidence of treatment success. Meanwhile, the economic incentives only reinforced the problem. Heroin-dependent patients required frequent appointments, regular prescriptions, and ongoing medical supervision, generating substantial income for physicians and pharmacies. By 1927, the medical establishment had created something unprecedented, a healthcare system that was systematically addicting patients while remaining completely convinced it was providing excellent care. But this medical disaster was operating within an even larger economic framework that few people understood. The heroin trade had become big business, generating profits that reached far beyond individual doctors and patients into the heart of Paris's commercial infrastructure. What happens when an entire city's economy becomes dependent on a single devastating product? By 1926, heroin wasn't just a medical problem or a cultural phenomenon in Paris. It had become the foundation of a shadow economy so vast and profitable that it was quietly supporting thousands of legitimate businesses. This is the story of how addiction became an industry and how that industry nearly consumed one of the world's greatest cities. The numbers alone will shock you. Economic historian Dr. Jean Bouvier, in his groundbreaking 1981 study, The Hidden Economy of Interwar Paris, calculated that by 1927, the heroin trade was generating approximately 50 million francs annually, roughly equivalent to $200 million in today's currency. To put that in perspective, that was more than the entire French wine export industry and nearly equal to the country's automobile manufacturing sector. But here's what makes this economic story truly fascinating. Most of the people profiting from heroin had no idea they were part of the drug trade. Take Maurice Benveniste, who owned a small glass-blowing workshop in the Marais district. According to his business ledgers, discovered by his grandson in 1975, Benveniste's orders for small glass vials increased by 400% between 1924 and 1926. He assumed he was benefiting from the growth in the pharmaceutical industry, which in a sense he was. What he didn't know was that 80% of his vials were being used to distribute heroin rather than legitimate medicine. The economic web was incredibly complex. Heroin addiction created demand for glass vials, silver syringes, medical scales, pharmaceutical labels, security boxes, and countless other products. Small manufacturers across Paris were experiencing mysterious booms in their businesses without understanding why. Louis Cartier, the famous jeweler, documented this phenomenon in his private business correspondence. In a 1926 letter to his brother, he wrote, "We've received an unusual number of commissions for small, ornate containers and miniature silver implements. The customers claim they're for medical purposes, and they're willing to pay premium prices for discretion and craftsmanship." Cartier was unknowingly creating luxury heroin paraphernalia for wealthy addicts who wanted their drug consumption to reflect their social status. But the real economic engine of the heroin trade wasn't manufacturing. It was logistics. Moving heroin from international suppliers to Parisian customers required an enormous network of transportation, storage, and distribution services. Most of these services were provided by legitimate businesses that had no idea what they were actually transporting. The French Postal Service became an unwitting partner in heroin distribution. Internal postal records declassified in 1995 show that package deliveries to certain Paris neighborhoods increased by 300% between 1924 and 1927. Postal workers noticed that these packages were often small, carefully wrapped, and sent with expensive insurance, but they assumed they contained valuable jewelry or important documents. Pierre Laval, who worked as a postal supervisor during this period, wrote in his retirement memoir, "We joked about the mystery packages that flooded certain routes. The addresses were always elegant, expensive neighborhoods, fine hotels, prestigious offices. We assumed Paris's upper classes had developed an obsession with mail-order luxury goods. The irony is devastating when you think about it. The French postal service, a symbol of civic order and social connection, was inadvertently enabling the destruction of the very communities it served. Real estate became another unexpected component of the heroin economy. Property owners in areas with high heroin traffic saw their rental income skyrocket as dealers competed for strategic locations. But these weren't traditional commercial rents. They were what economist Gabriel Pellet called addiction premiums. Apartment building owner Madame Céleste Dubois, whose rental records were preserved by her family, saw her income from a single Montmartre building increase from 2,000 francs annually in 1923 to 12,000 francs in 1926. She attributed this windfall to the artistic renaissance making Montmartre fashionable again. She had no idea that 3 of her tenants were major heroin dealers, and the others were their customers. The banking system became deeply entangled in heroin economics, though bankers remained largely oblivious to the source of their new wealth. Credit Lyonnais bank records, analyzed by financial historian Michel Lecuyer, show massive increases in cash deposits from certain customer categories: independent medical consultants, pharmaceutical representatives, and cultural event organizers. These were euphemistic job descriptions for heroin dealers, but the bank's due diligence procedures weren't sophisticated enough to recognize the pattern. Bankers saw successful professionals making large, regular cash deposits and assumed they were witnessing the prosperity of modern French commerce. Bank manager Henry Rothschild, not related to the famous banking family, documented this phenomenon in his private journals. He wrote in 1926, "Our clientele has become remarkably prosperous. Medical professionals and cultural entrepreneurs are depositing extraordinary amounts of cash. Paris's economy appears to be experiencing an unprecedented boom." He was right about the boom. He was completely wrong about its source. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of heroin's economic impact was how it affected legitimate businesses that should have been competitors. Traditional entertainment venues, theaters, restaurants, conventional clubs began losing customers to heroin-focused establishments. Instead of competing, many adapted their business models to accommodate the heroin economy. Restaurant owner Claude Terrail, whose family still operates the famous Tour d'Argent, wrote in his business diary about the mysterious changes in customer behavior during the mid-1920s. Customers were ordering less food, spending more time at tables, and requesting private dining rooms for medical discussions. Rather than lose business, Terrail began marketing discreet dining experiences for medical consultations. He was unknowingly providing venues for heroin consumption while maintaining the pretense of operating a respectable restaurant. The economic impact extended into unexpected sectors. Paris fashion houses reported increased demand for clothing with hidden pockets, loose fits, and long sleeves. Furniture makers received orders for pieces with secret compartments. Even the city's thriving cafe culture adapted, with many establishments quietly tolerating heroin use in back rooms while maintaining respectable facades in their main dining areas. Insurance companies found themselves dealing with unprecedented claim patterns without understanding their true cause. Life insurance payouts increased dramatically. Property insurance claims rose due to medical accidents in homes and businesses, and health insurance costs skyrocketed due to mysterious ailments that required expensive ongoing treatment. Actuary Paul Rivet, working for Assurances Générales de France, documented these trends in his confidential reports to management. He wrote in 1927, "We observe unusual mortality and morbidity patterns among certain demographic groups, particularly affluent individuals involved in cultural or medical professions. The causes appear medical in nature, but the patterns are unlike anything in our historical data." The insurance industry was paying for the heroin epidemic without realizing it existed. But the most insidious aspect of heroin's economic impact was how it created dependencies that went far beyond individual addiction. Entire neighborhoods, industries, and social networks had become economically dependent on the heroin trade. When authorities finally began cracking down in the late 1920s, the economic disruption was catastrophic for many legitimate businesses that had unknowingly built their prosperity on drug money. This economic web was so complex and deeply embedded that it took decades to untangle. Some businesses never recovered from the loss of their heroin-related income streams. Others adapted by finding new ways to serve addicted populations or by moving into different markets entirely. Have you ever wondered how economic systems can become so corrupted that they continue functioning even when they're causing tremendous social harm? The heroin economy of 1920s Paris provides a perfect case study. Thousands of people profiting from destruction without even knowing they were part of the machine. But while Paris was discovering the devastating power of drug economics, something even more heartbreaking was unfolding in the shadows. Behind all the business transactions, international smuggling networks, and medical malpractice, real people were falling in love, getting married, and trying to build lives together, all while battling dependencies that would test the very limits of human devotion and ultimately redefine what we mean when we talk about love conquering all. Among all the statistics, economics, and cultural analysis of the 1920s Paris heroin epidemic, the most heartbreaking stories are the most personal ones. Love didn't disappear when heroin arrived. It transformed, twisted, and became something both beautiful and terrible. This is the chapter nobody wants to talk about: how couples fell in love over shared needles, how marriages survived through mutual addiction, and how some of the most devoted relationships in human history were built on the foundation of shared chemical dependency. These love stories will break your heart, but they'll also reveal something profound about human connection under the most impossible circumstances. Let me tell you about Marie and André Dubois. Not their real names, but that's how they're identified in the social work files discovered at the Bibliothèque historique de la ville de Paris. Marie was a seamstress from Lyon who came to Paris in 1924 to work in the fashion industry. André was an aspiring composer from a middle-class family studying at the Paris Conservatory. They met at a café in Montparnasse in September 1924. And according to Marie's diary entries found in her family's estate, it was love at first sight. Their courtship began conventionally enough: long walks along the Seine, shared meals at inexpensive bistros, conversations about art and music that lasted until dawn. But by December 1924, both were using heroin regularly for what they believed were medical reasons. Marie had been prescribed it for feminine anxiety, Andre for compositional stress. What makes their story fascinating is how heroin became integrated into their romantic rituals. Marie wrote in her diary in February 1925, "Andre and I have discovered that we understand each other most completely when we take our medicine together. Our conversations reach depths impossible in ordinary consciousness. We speak of music, of beauty, of eternity itself. They weren't just falling in love with each other. They were falling in love with a version of themselves that heroin created." Their wedding in June 1925 was attended by dozens of other couples who shared similar relationships with pharmaceutical enhancement. Social worker Catherine Pellier, who documented expatriate communities for the French government, described these gatherings in her confidential reports. "I observe wedding celebrations where the traditional champagne toast is replaced by group administration of German medicine. The couples appear extraordinarily serene and devoted to each other, but there is something unsettling about their perfect tranquility." She was witnessing the first generation of marriages built around shared addiction. The daily rhythms of these relationships were unlike anything in human history. Andre's composition notebook, preserved in the family archives, shows how the couple structured their entire life around medication schedules. They woke together, took their morning doses together, worked separately during peak effectiveness hours, reunited for afternoon doses, and spent evenings in what Andre called enhanced communion. But here's what makes these relationships so tragically beautiful. The couples genuinely cared for each other with extraordinary devotion. When Marie's heroin supply was interrupted in March 1926, Andre sold his piano to buy her medicine on the black market. When Andre collapsed from an overdose that same month, Marie stayed by his bedside for 6 days, administering careful doses to prevent withdrawal while nursing him back to health. Their love letters, discovered decades later, reveal relationships of incredible intimacy and mutual protection. In one letter from Andre to Marie, written during a brief separation in 1926, he wrote, "My darling, I count the hours until we can again share our medicine and our souls. Without you, the enhancement feels empty, meaningless. You're not just my wife. You're my partner in exploring consciousness itself." These weren't casual drug users. They were couples who had created entire philosophical frameworks around their shared dependency. Dr. Louis Brouillard, the physician we've mentioned before, documented several of these relationships in his private case studies. He was particularly fascinated by how heroin-dependent couples developed what he called synchronized tolerance. They seemed to require similar dose increases at similar intervals, as if their bodies were adapting to the drug in harmony with each other. One couple he treated, identified only as Mr. and Mrs. T, had been married for 3 years when they began using heroin together in 1925. By 1927, they were injecting heroin every 4 hours on a schedule so precise that Brouillard noted they have achieved a pharmaceutical synchronization that appears almost mystical. Their dependency has become a form of biological unity. But the most tragic aspect of these relationships was how they dealt with the inevitable crisis of escalating addiction. When one partner needed more heroin, both increased their usage to maintain their shared experience. When money ran short, they made devastating sacrifices together. When health problems emerged, they supported each other through withdrawal and relapse cycles. American social worker Jane Addams, who visited Paris in 1926 and documented the expatriate community, described witnessing a couple's morning routine in Montmartre. The young man prepared the medicine with the precision of a pharmacist, while his wife arranged their living space for optimal comfort. They administered the injections to each other with tender care, then spent the next hours in quiet conversation about subjects that seemed profoundly meaningful to them, but incomprehensible to observers. She was watching a marriage ceremony that happened multiple times daily. The correspondence between heroin-dependent couples reveals relationships of extraordinary emotional intensity. Pierre and Marguerite Laval, both painters who had met in Montparnasse, wrote letters to each other even when living in the same studio apartment. Their letters, found by their landlord after their deaths in 1928, show two people trying to articulate experiences that ordinary language couldn't capture. Marguerite wrote to Pierre in 1927, "My beloved, when we share our medicine, I feel that I understand not just your thoughts, but your soul's very structure. We have discovered something beyond ordinary marriage, a unity of consciousness that most couples never achieve." Pierre responded, "My darling Marguerite, we are pioneers of a new kind of love. Future generations will envy what we have discovered together." They believed they were evolutionary pioneers rather than addiction casualties. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of these relationships was their durability under impossible circumstances. When heroin supplies became expensive or dangerous to obtain, these couples didn't abandon each other. They made increasingly desperate sacrifices to maintain their shared dependency. Paul and Elizabeth Morel, documented in police records from 1927, sold their furniture, then their clothing, then finally their wedding rings to buy heroin. When arrested for theft, they were found in their empty apartment, lying on the floor together, having shared their last dose. The police report noted, "Despite their obviously desperate circumstances, the subjects displayed remarkable affection and mutual care." The most tragic love story I've encountered in the archives involves an American couple, Robert and Sarah Chen, who came to Paris for their honeymoon in 1925 and never left. Their joint diary, discovered by their families decades later, documents a 2-year descent into complete heroin dependency, during which their love for each other only intensified. Their final entry, written in Sarah's handwriting in 1927, reads, "Robert and I have decided that if we cannot live together in the enhanced state that has defined our marriage, we prefer not to live at all. We have enough medicine for one final perfect day together. We regret nothing except that the world couldn't understand what we found in each other." They died together from an intentional overdose, holding hands in their Montparnasse studio. These weren't stories of love destroyed by drugs. They were stories of love transformed by drugs into something simultaneously more intense and more fragile than ordinary human relationships. The couples created private worlds of shared consciousness that were simultaneously beautiful and devastating. Do you think it's possible to truly love someone when you're both chemically altered? the heroin couples of 1920s Paris would have answered that question differently than we might today. They believed they had discovered enhanced love, deeper intimacy, truer understanding. From the outside, it looks like mutual destruction disguised as romance. But while adults were making these complex, tragic choices about love and drugs, something even more heartbreaking was happening to those who had no choice in the matter at all. The children of 1920s Paris were growing up in a world where heroin was as common as wine, where their parents' emotional availability fluctuated with pharmaceutical schedules, and where the very concept of normal childhood was being redefined by the chemical revolution happening all around them. The most devastating casualties of any epidemic are always the innocent ones who never chose to be involved. In 1920s, Paris, while adults made choices about heroin, however misguided those choices were, thousands of children found themselves growing up in a world where their parents' love came with pharmaceutical conditions. This is perhaps the most heartbreaking chapter of our story. How an entire generation of Parisian children learned to navigate childhood in homes where heroin dictated the emotional weather. What happened to these children would haunt Paris for decades to come. Let me introduce you to a social worker named Marguerite Clemel, who documented the lives of children in heroin-affected families for the City of Paris Social Services. Her case files, archived at the Paris Municipal Library and discovered by child welfare historian Dr. Sophie Chauveau in 1989, paint a devastating picture of childhood during the heroin epidemic. In one report from 1926, Clemel wrote, "I visit homes where children as young as 5 years old can predict their parents' moods based on medication schedules. They know that mornings before medicine are dangerous times for requests or questions. They understand that evenings after medicine are when parents become loving but distant. These children are developing emotional intelligence around pharmaceutical cycles rather than human emotions." Think about what that means for a moment. Children learning that love has a schedule, that attention comes in chemical waves, that their parents' ability to care for them depends on a substance rather than natural affection. The demographics were staggering. According to census records analyzed by urban historian Michel Pinson, approximately 12,000 children in Paris lived in households where at least one parent was using heroin regularly by 1927. These weren't just families from poor neighborhoods. They included children of artists, writers, doctors, and society figures across every arrondissement of the city. 8-year-old Henri Morin, whose story is documented in his school records preserved at the Bibliothèque Nationale, lived with his parents in a comfortable Montparnasse apartment. His teacher, Mademoiselle Rousseau, noted concerning changes in Henri's behavior throughout 1925 and 1926. Her classroom observations, written in careful script, tell a heartbreaking story. Henri arrives at school each morning in clean clothes and with adequate meals, she wrote. But he displays unusual anxiety about returning home. When asked about his family, he responds with adult phrases that seem rehearsed. Mama is receiving medical treatment, or Papa requires rest for his artistic work. The child appears to be protecting secrets he doesn't fully understand. Children were becoming accomplices to their parents' addiction without understanding what they were protecting. The most tragic aspect was how these children adapted to maintain some semblance of family stability. Dr. Alice Zimmern, one of the few child psychologists practicing in Paris during this period, documented what she called premature caretaking behaviors in her clinical notes housed in the archives of French psychology. She described 7-year-old Celine, whose mother was a heroin-dependent society woman. The child has learned to prepare simple meals, manage household finances, and even remind her mother of social appointments. When her mother is incapacitated by withdrawal or overdose, Celine tells visitors that Mama has a headache and requires rest. She's become the adult in the household while maintaining the fiction that she's being cared for. Children were essentially raising themselves while protecting their parents' reputations and secrets. But here's what makes this story even more complex. Many heroin-dependent parents genuinely loved their children and tried to provide good care within the constraints of their addiction. They weren't monsters. They were people struggling with dependency while attempting to maintain family relationships. The Diary of Lucienne Moreau, a painter and mother of 2 young daughters, provides insight into this impossible situation. Her journal, found in her studio after her death in 1928, reveals a woman tormented by her inability to be present for her children while being unable to function without heroin. She wrote in 1926, "I watch my daughters playing in the garden and feel such love for them, but it's as if I'm observing them through glass. The medicine allows me to function, to work, to provide for them, but it also separates me from the immediate experience of loving them. I fear they will remember me as beautiful but distant, like a portrait rather than a mother." Her daughters, interviewed decades later by oral historian Mona Ozef, confirmed this exact perception. They remembered their mother as elegant and kind, but somehow not quite there. Present physically, but emotionally unreachable. The children developed sophisticated coping mechanisms that were both impressive and heartbreaking. Many learned to read the subtle signs of their parents' pharmaceutical states: pupil dilation, speech patterns, energy levels, attention spans. They adapted their own behavior accordingly, becoming quiet and self-sufficient during withdrawal periods, seeking affection during peak effectiveness windows. 10-year-old Marcel Duchamp, not related to the famous artist, was documented by school social worker Marie Laurence in 1927. Her notes describe a child who had developed uncanny intuition about adult emotional states. Marcel can predict within minutes when his father will become irritable, affectionate, or completely withdrawn. The child has learned to anticipate pharmaceutical cycles with greater accuracy than the parent himself. These children were developing emotional intelligence around chemical dependency rather than normal human relationships. The economic impact on children was devastating but often invisible. Families spent enormous portions of their income on heroin, leaving less money for children's clothing, education, and activities. But because heroin was expensive rather than illegal, these families maintained middle-class appearances while their children went without necessities. School records from École Léonard de Vinci, preserved in the Paris Education Archives, show declining enrollment in paid activities and increasing numbers of children arriving without proper school supplies. Teacher reports noted children wearing the same clothes repeatedly, carrying inadequate lunches, and expressing anxiety about family financial problems. But perhaps the most tragic aspect was how these children's understanding of normality became completely distorted. They grew up thinking that adult emotional unavailability was standard, that love came with conditions and schedules, that family stability required careful management of adult moods and needs. Child psychologist Dr. René Spitz, who studied Parisian families during this period, documented what he called inherited emotional patterns in his research notes. Children of heroin-dependent parents showed unusual difficulty with emotional regulation, trust in relationships, and understanding of cause and effect in human interactions. One case study involved siblings Pierre and Marie Dubois, ages 9 and 7, whose parents were both heroin-dependent artists. Dr. Spitz observed their play patterns and found that their games consistently involved medical scenarios where dolls received treatments that made them calm and happy. The children had internalized the idea that emotional well-being required pharmaceutical intervention. The most heartbreaking discovery in the archives is how some children tried to help their parents overcome addiction. Letters written by 12-year-old Antoinette Rousseau to her heroin-dependent mother, found in family papers donated to the Bibliothèque Historique, show a child trying to use love and reason to compete with chemical dependency. Dear Mama, one letter reads, "I have saved my allowance to buy you flowers instead of your medicine. Please try to be happy with just my love today. I promise to be very good and quiet so you won't need the medicine to feel peaceful." A 12-year-old child trying to cure her mother's addiction with pocket money and perfect behavior. By 1927, Paris had an entire generation of children who had learned to navigate the world with the assumption that adult emotions were chemically controlled, that family stability required constant vigilance and management, and that love was conditional on circumstances beyond their control. These children would carry these lessons into adulthood, affecting their own relationships, parenting styles, and understanding of emotional intimacy for decades to come. The heroin epidemic didn't just damage the people who used the drug, it rewrote the emotional programming of an entire generation of children who never chose to be involved. But while families were struggling with these intimate tragedies, the larger machinery of government was finally beginning to wake up to the scope of the crisis. The same officials who had ignored or dismissed early warnings were about to attempt solutions that would prove almost as devastating as the problem itself. Their response would reveal just how unprepared society was to deal with the monster that pharmaceutical innovation and cultural permissiveness had created together. When governments finally decide to act against a crisis they've ignored for years, the results are often more catastrophic than the original problem. By late 1926, French officials could no longer pretend that Paris didn't have a heroin epidemic, but their response would prove so spectacularly misguided, so criminally incompetent, that it transformed a medical crisis into a social disaster that would define drug policy failures for the next century. This is the story of how good intentions, bureaucratic arrogance, and complete misunderstanding of addiction created solutions that were worse than the disease. The wake-up call came in the form of a single devastating statistic compiled by Dr. Maurice Latoul, the city's chief medical examiner. His 1926 annual report, archived at the Paris Prefecture of Police, contained a number that shocked even the most jaded officials. heroin-related deaths in Paris had increased by 847% since 1922. But here's the kicker. This number only included deaths where heroin was explicitly mentioned on death certificates. The real number was likely much higher. Interior Minister Albert Sarraute received Dr. Latoul's report in January 1927 and immediately convened what he grandly called the Commission for the Elimination of the German Pharmaceutical Problem. Notice the language. They still couldn't bring themselves to call it a drug crisis. It was a German pharmaceutical problem, as if the issue was primarily one of international trade rather than domestic addiction. The Commission's first meeting, documented in stenographic notes discovered by political historian Jean-Noël Jeannenet, reveals the breathtaking ignorance of French leadership about the crisis they were attempting to solve. Minister Sarraute opened the meeting by declaring, "Gentlemen, we face a simple supply problem. German pharmaceutical companies have flooded our markets with an addictive substance. The solution is equally simple. We eliminate the supply." It was like trying to solve alcoholism by prohibiting grapes. The Commission's first action was to ban all heroin imports effective immediately. No transition period, no treatment programs, no consideration of the thousands of Parisians who were physically dependent on the drug. On March 15, 1927, heroin became illegal in France overnight. The results were catastrophic. Dr. Paul Carnot, who ran a private clinic treating wealthy addicts, documented the immediate aftermath in his emergency medical logs. Within 48 hours of the ban, his clinic was flooded with patients experiencing severe withdrawal symptoms. Within a week, he was treating cases of delirium tremens, seizures, and complete psychological breakdowns. "We have created a humanitarian crisis," he wrote to the Minister of Health. "Patients who were functional members of society yesterday are today writhing in agony, hallucinating, and begging for death. This is not medical treatment. This is torture." The government's response was to arrest Dr. Carnot for encouraging illegal pharmaceutical dependency. But the real disaster was happening on the streets. The overnight prohibition had eliminated legal heroin supplies, but done nothing to eliminate demand. Within days, a black market emerged that made the previous semi-legal trade look positively civilized. Police Inspector Jean Chiappe, who led France's first drug enforcement efforts, documented this transformation in his confidential reports to the prefecture. His observations, declassified in 1987, paint a picture of rapid social breakdown. The elimination of pharmaceutical suppliers has not eliminated heroin users. Instead, it has driven them into the hands of criminal organizations who show no concern for product quality, customer safety, or public order. Street heroin began appearing immediately, but it bore no resemblance to the pharmaceutical-grade product people had been using. Criminal suppliers cut pure heroin with everything from baking soda to rat poison to increase their profits. Overdoses skyrocketed as users had no way to predict the potency of their doses. The mortality statistics are staggering. According to police records compiled by crime historian Michel Perrault, heroin-related deaths in Paris increased by 340% in the 6 months following Prohibition. The government's solution had tripled the death rate overnight. But perhaps the most tragic consequence was how prohibition destroyed the support networks that had kept many users relatively stable. The jazz clubs, artistic salons, and social gatherings where people had used heroin in community settings disappeared, replaced by secretive, paranoid consumption in isolated circumstances. Josephine Baker, writing in her unpublished memoirs, described visiting Montmartre in late 1927. The places where artists once gathered to share music and medicine had become ghostly. The few people I encountered looked haunted, desperate, constantly watching for police. The creativity that heroin had seemed to enhance was being strangled by fear and desperation. The government's approach to treatment was equally disastrous. Rather than developing medical protocols for helping people overcome heroin dependency, authorities treated addiction as a moral failing requiring punishment. The few treatment facilities that existed were essentially prisons where addicts were confined until they chose to stop using drugs. Dr. Henry Baruch, a psychiatrist who witnessed these early treatment attempts, described the approach in his clinical journals. Patients are confined in barren rooms and denied all medication, while being told that recovery is simply a matter of willpower. The physical and psychological agony is indescribable. Many patients emerge from treatment more damaged than when they entered. The government was treating addiction as if it were a character defect rather than a medical condition. Meanwhile, the elimination of legal supply chains had completely transformed the economics of heroin distribution. Professional criminals moved into the trade, bringing with them violence, territorial disputes, and sophisticated smuggling operations. What had been a medical problem was becoming a criminal enterprise. The prefecture's crime statistics from 1928, analyzed by criminologist Philippe Robert, show the emergence of organized heroin trafficking. Armed robberies increased by 200%. Prostitution expanded dramatically as addicts sought money for increasingly expensive drugs, and violent crime in general spiked across neighborhoods with high addiction rates. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of the government's response was how it criminalized the victims rather than helping them. Police began conducting raids on private homes, arresting anyone found with heroin, regardless of whether they were dealers or desperate addicts seeking relief from withdrawal symptoms. The arrest records make for heartbreaking reading. Marie Curie's laboratory assistant was arrested for possessing a single vial of heroin she had purchased for medical use. Ernest Hemingway's friend, American painter Gerald Murphy, was detained for 3 days for heroin possession, an experience that probably contributed to his decision to leave Paris permanently. Society families began disowning members who were arrested on drug charges. The Countess de Polignac, whose addiction we discussed earlier, was found dead in a hotel room in 1928, abandoned by her family and unable to access either legal medical care or reliable illegal supplies. The government's moral approach to drug policy was destroying the very people it claimed to be protecting. What makes this policy disaster even more tragic is that a few voices were trying to propose alternative approaches. Dr. Vincent Dole, an American physician working in Paris, submitted a detailed proposal to the health ministry suggesting maintenance therapy and gradual reduction protocols. His plan, preserved in the ministry archives, outlined how heroin users could be gradually weaned off the drug with medical supervision while remaining functional members of society. The proposal was rejected without consideration. The official response, signed by Deputy Health Minister Paul Strauss, stated, "The ministry cannot endorse any approach that appears to accommodate criminal behavior. Heroin addiction is a choice, and recovery must be based on the addict's decision to choose differently." They rejected medical science in favor of moral philosophy. By 1928, the French government's response to the heroin crisis had created problems worse than the original epidemic. Legal users had been driven into criminal markets. Death rates had skyrocketed. Organized crime had taken over distribution. Families were being destroyed by arrests and social stigma. And thousands of people were suffering without access to either legal medical care or safe illegal alternatives. The prohibition model that France pioneered in response to the Paris heroin epidemic would be copied by governments worldwide, creating a template for drug policy that prioritized punishment over treatment, moral judgment over medical care, and political symbolism over practical solutions. But this disaster in Paris was happening just as the rest of the world was beginning to pay attention to what they initially saw as a uniquely French problem. International organizations, foreign governments, and global health officials were watching the crisis unfold and trying to understand whether this pharmaceutical nightmare could spread beyond the City of Light. Their response would determine whether heroin addiction remained a Parisian curiosity or became a worldwide catastrophe. Sometimes a crisis becomes so visible that the rest of the world can no longer look away. By 1928, the heroin epidemic that had consumed Paris was sending shockwaves through diplomatic circles, international health organizations, and foreign governments who suddenly realized they might be witnessing the birth of a global catastrophe. What started as a peculiar French problem was about to become the template for the world's first international drug control system, and the results would be just as disastrous as France's domestic response. This is how a Parisian medical crisis became the foundation for a century of failed global drug policy. The international awakening began with a single diplomatic cable that would change everything. On September 12, 1928, British Ambassador to France Lord Crewe sent an urgent dispatch to the Foreign Office in London. His message, declassified in 1978 and housed in the British National Archives, contained alarming intelligence about the scope of the Paris crisis. Crewe wrote, "The situation in Paris has deteriorated beyond French government control. British citizens residing in France are increasingly affected by what can only be described as a pharmaceutical epidemic. More troubling, we have evidence that similar patterns are emerging in London, particularly among artistic and intellectual communities with connections to Paris." The heroin epidemic was crossing borders. Within weeks, similar reports were flooding diplomatic channels from across Europe and America. The American Embassy in Paris, in a classified report dated October 1928, documented that over 200 American citizens had been treated for German pharmaceutical dependency in Parisian hospitals during the previous year. More ominously, many of these Americans were returning home with their habits intact. Dr. Hamilton Wright, America's first opium commissioner, received these diplomatic reports with growing alarm. His confidential memorandum to the State Department, preserved in the National Archives, reveals the international community's dawning realization of what they were facing. The Paris situation represents something unprecedented in human history: the industrial-scale creation of pharmaceutical dependency. If this phenomenon spreads internationally, we face a threat to social stability that could dwarf any previous public health crisis. He wasn't wrong, but his proposed solutions would prove catastrophically misguided. The League of Nations, predecessor to the United Nations, convened an emergency session in Geneva in December 1928 to address what they formally titled the International Pharmaceutical Dependency Crisis. The meeting brought together diplomats, medical experts, and government officials from 23 countries, making it one of the largest international health conferences in history up to that point. The transcripts of this meeting, archived at the League of Nations Historical Archives in Geneva, reveal the stunning ignorance of international leaders about addiction, chemistry, and human psychology. The discussions read like a comedy of errors, except the consequences were deadly serious. Sir Malcolm de Leavingen, Britain's representative, opened the conference with breathtaking confidence. "Gentlemen, we face a supply problem with a simple solution. The German pharmaceutical industry has created an international poison. We shall eliminate this poison through coordinated international prohibition." Dr. Renato Calais, representing Brazil, raised the obvious question: but what of the millions of people already dependent on this substance? Prohibition without treatment will surely cause mass suffering. The response from French delegate Henri Brière perfectly captured the moral arrogance that would define international drug policy. Addiction is ultimately a failure of character. International prohibition will force individuals to choose between continued criminal behavior and moral reform. The temporary suffering of withdrawal is preferable to the permanent suffering of dependency. They were about to impose their moral philosophy on millions of physically dependent people without any understanding of addiction medicine. The conference's final resolution, signed on December 23, 1928, created the International Opium Convention, the world's first international drug control treaty. The document, available in the League of Nations Treaty Collection, banned the production, distribution, and possession of heroin globally, with no exceptions for medical use, addiction treatment, or transitional care. The treaty went into effect on January 1, 1929, making heroin illegal simultaneously in 23 countries. The results were predictably catastrophic. Dr. Auguste Forel, a Swiss psychiatrist who'd been quietly treating heroin addiction with maintenance therapy, documented the immediate aftermath in his clinical journals. Within days of international prohibition, his patients were experiencing severe withdrawal symptoms. Black market dealers had appeared in Swiss cities, and crime rates were spiking in neighborhoods with high addiction rates. "We have created an international humanitarian crisis," he wrote to the League of Nations Health Committee. "Patients who were stable and functional yesterday are today desperate criminals willing to commit any act to obtain the substance their bodies require for survival." The League's response was to investigate Dr. Forel for encouraging international criminal activity. But the most shocking aspect of international prohibition was how it created the global criminal networks that would dominate drug trafficking for the next century. The overnight elimination of legal supply chains created enormous profit opportunities for anyone willing to operate outside the law. Police records from major European cities, compiled by criminologist Cyril Finaut in his 1991 study of international organized crime, show the rapid emergence of sophisticated smuggling operations connecting opium producers in Asia with heroin consumers in Europe and America. These weren't the small-scale artisanal operations that had supplied Paris. These were multinational criminal enterprises with the resources and ruthlessness to fill the gap left by Prohibition. The irony is devastating. International efforts to eliminate heroin trafficking created the very criminal networks they sought to destroy. American Treasury Department reports from 1929, declassified in 1979, document the explosion of heroin smuggling across the Atlantic. Agent Harry Anslinger, who would later become America's first drug czar, wrote in his initial assessment, "International prohibition has not eliminated heroin availability. It has simply transferred control from regulated pharmaceutical companies to unregulated criminal organizations. We have solved nothing and complicated everything." Meanwhile, the human cost was mounting rapidly across multiple continents. Hospital emergency rooms from London to New York were reporting unprecedented numbers of overdose cases as users struggled with unpredictable black market heroin potency. Crime rates were spiking in every major city with significant heroin-using populations. But perhaps the most tragic consequence of international prohibition was how it prevented the development of effective addiction treatment. By defining heroin use as criminal behavior rather than a medical condition, the international community eliminated any possibility of research into maintenance therapy, gradual reduction programs, or other medical approaches to dependency. Dr. Marie Neiswander, an American physician who would later pioneer methadone maintenance therapy, wrote in her 1930 journal about the devastating impact of criminalization on medical research. "We have made it illegal to study the very substance we claim to want to eliminate. How can we develop effective treatments when research itself has been classified as criminal activity?" The answer was simple. They couldn't. International prohibition effectively ended scientific research into heroin addiction for decades, ensuring that future responses would be based on moral judgment rather than medical understanding. By 1930, the International Opium Convention had been signed by 47 countries, creating the world's first global prohibition regime. But instead of solving the heroin problem, international prohibition had transformed a localized medical crisis into a worldwide criminal enterprise that would generate violence, corruption, and human suffering on an unprecedented scale. The Paris heroin epidemic had ended, but only because it had evolved into something much larger and more dangerous: the global war on drugs, with all the violence, incarceration, and social destruction that would follow. Looking back at these international conferences and diplomatic cables, one is struck by the absolute confidence of officials who understood nothing about the crisis they were attempting to solve. They approached addiction as if it were a supply chain problem rather than a medical condition, criminality rather than dependency, moral failure rather than chemical compulsion. Have you ever wondered how intelligent, well-meaning people can make decisions that seem so obviously wrong in retrospect? The international response to the Paris heroin crisis provides a perfect case study in how moral certainty can override scientific evidence, how political symbolism can triumph over practical solutions. But as the 1920s drew to a close, an even larger catastrophe was approaching that would test every assumption about society, economics, and human resilience. The stock market crash of 1929 was about to collide with the heroin crisis in ways that would reveal just how fragile the social fabric had become when chemical dependency, economic desperation, and political failure converged in the same historical moment. Nothing reveals the true fragility of society like the moment when two catastrophes collide. On October 24, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed, sending shockwaves that would devastate economies worldwide. But in Paris, the crash didn't just destroy fortunes. It collided with an existing heroin epidemic to create a perfect storm of desperation that would redefine what we thought we knew about human behavior under extreme stress. What happened next was so dark, so unprecedented, that most historians still struggle to fully document its scope. This is the story of how economic collapse transformed addiction from a medical problem into a survival strategy. The initial impact was swift and brutal. Within weeks of Black Thursday, American expatriates who had lived comfortably in Paris for years found themselves completely destitute. The favorable exchange rates that had made Paris affordable for American artists, writers, and intellectuals evaporated overnight. But for those dependent on heroin, the financial crisis represented something far worse than mere poverty. It was a potential death sentence. Sylvia Beach, owner of Shakespeare and Company, documented the immediate aftermath in her private correspondence with her sister. In a letter dated November 15, 1929, she wrote, "The Americans are fleeing Paris as if escaping a plague, but some cannot leave. Those who have developed dependencies on German medicines find themselves trapped, too poor to afford their treatments, too sick to travel home, too desperate to think clearly." Dr. Henri Mondor, the physician we've encountered before, found himself treating patients facing an impossible choice: spend their last money on food or heroin. His medical journal from December 1929 contains heart-wrenching case studies. Patient presents with severe malnutrition alongside withdrawal symptoms, has not eaten in 3 days, but somehow obtained enough heroin to prevent seizures. When asked about priorities, patient responds, "I can survive hunger, but I cannot survive withdrawal." The crash revealed something terrifying about heroin addiction that the medical establishment hadn't fully grasped. It wasn't just a dependency. It was a biological imperative that overrode every other human need, including survival itself. The economic data tells a devastating story. According to financial records analyzed by economic historian François Crouzet, the average American expatriate in Paris saw their purchasing power decline by 85% within 6 months of the crash. For heroin-dependent individuals, this meant choosing between rent and drugs, food and drugs, medicine for their families, and drugs for themselves. Hemingway's friend, painter Gerald Murphy, documented this impossible mathematics in his private letters. Writing to his wife Sarah in January 1930, he described visiting friends who were calculating whether they could afford both heroin and heat for their apartment. They chose heroin. I found them wrapped in blankets, shivering, but chemically calm. The social consequences were immediate and devastating. Crime rates in neighborhoods with high American populations skyrocketed as desperate addicts turned to theft, fraud, and prostitution to fund their habits. Police records from the 6th and 14th arrondissements, preserved in the prefecture archives, show armed robbery increasing by 400% between October 1929 and March 1930. But perhaps the most shocking development was how economic desperation drove innovation in the drug trade. With legal pharmaceutical heroin now banned and black market prices soaring due to demand from desperate users, entrepreneurs began developing cheaper alternatives that were far more dangerous than anything seen before. Police chemist Dr. Alphonse Bertillon analyzed dozens of street drug samples seized in early 1930. His report filed with the prefecture documented substances that were barely recognizable as heroin. Street dealers are mixing opium residue with industrial chemicals, household cleaning products, and unknown organic compounds. The resulting mixture produces heroin-like effects, but with toxicity levels that are essentially unpredictable. Desperate people were injecting industrial poison because they couldn't afford pharmaceutical-grade heroin. The most tragic cases involved families where multiple members were dependent on heroin. Social worker Marie Dubois documented several families facing complete destruction as the crash eliminated their ability to support multiple habits. In one case study from February 1930, she described a family of 4 both parents and 2 adult children, all heroin-dependent, trying to survive on unemployment benefits that wouldn't cover even one person's habit. The family has implemented a rotation system, she wrote. Each member goes without heroin for 3 days, while the others maintain their doses. Then they switch. They are essentially taking turns being sick to keep the family functional. I have never witnessed such systematic self-sacrifice in service of addiction. But the crash also revealed something unexpected about human resilience under extreme circumstances. Some heroin users, faced with the absolute impossibility of maintaining their habits, managed to overcome addictions that had seemed insurmountable when they had financial resources. Dr. Paul Salyer, the physician who had treated many wealthy addicts, documented this phenomenon in his clinical notes. Several of his patients, who had failed multiple treatment attempts, suddenly achieved sobriety when economic circumstances made continued use literally impossible. Poverty, he wrote, has accomplished what months of medical intervention could not. However, these success stories were vastly outnumbered by tragedies. The combination of heroin withdrawal and economic desperation proved deadly for many. Suicide rates among the American expatriate community increased dramatically, with many leaving notes that mentioned their inability to afford both heroin and basic survival needs. The French government, already struggling with a broader economic crisis, found itself completely unprepared for the intersection of financial collapse and drug addiction. Social services designed for temporary unemployment assistance were overwhelmed by people requiring both economic support and medical treatment for withdrawal symptoms. Minister of Health Paul Dumer's confidential memorandum to the cabinet, discovered in the National Archives, reveals the government's panic. we face an unprecedented social crisis. Traditional unemployment assistance assumes recipients can function normally while seeking work. These individuals cannot function without expensive medical treatment that we cannot provide legally, and they cannot afford illegally. The crash had created a population of unemployable addicts who were too sick to work but too poor to get well. International observers watched the Paris situation with growing alarm, recognizing that economic instability could transform any drug problem into a humanitarian catastrophe. British Home Office reports from 1930, declassified in 1980, warned that the Paris situation demonstrates how quickly drug dependency can evolve from a medical issue to a security threat when combined with economic desperation. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the crash on Paris's heroin epidemic was how it changed public perception of addiction. Before 1929, heroin use had been associated with artistic sophistication, medical treatment, and cultural rebellion. After the crash, it became associated with crime, desperation, and social danger. Newspaper coverage shifted dramatically. Where once heroin users had been portrayed as misguided bohemians, they were now depicted as dangerous criminals threatening public safety. This shift in perception would influence drug policy for decades to come. By mid-1930, the combination of economic collapse and heroin prohibition had created something unprecedented in Paris. A population of people who were simultaneously addicted, impoverished, criminalized, and medically untreated. They represented a new category of social casualty that existing institutions were completely unprepared to address. The crash had revealed the final devastating truth about the heroin epidemic. Addiction wasn't just a medical or moral problem. It was a social time bomb that could explode whenever other systems failed. Economic stability, legal frameworks, medical care, and family support had all been necessary to contain the damage. When the crash eliminated economic stability, the entire structure collapsed. This perfect storm of addiction, poverty, prohibition, and desperation would reshape not just Paris, but the entire world's approach to drug policy, social services, and economic security. The lessons learned from this catastrophic collision would echo through history, influencing policy decisions for generations to come, though whether those lessons were learned correctly remains a question that haunts us to this day. As we reach the final chapter of our story, we must examine how these devastating experiences transformed into the policies and institutions that still govern our approach to addiction today, and whether the legacy of 1920s Paris represents wisdom gained or trauma institutionalized. What legacy does a lost decade leave behind? As we stand at the end of our journey through 1920s Paris, looking back at the wreckage of lives, families, and dreams that heroin addiction left in its wake, we must ask ourselves, what did the world learn from this catastrophe? The answer is both inspiring and heartbreaking, because the lessons of Paris shaped everything that followed, though not always in the ways we might hope. By 1935, the acute phase of the Paris heroin epidemic had largely ended, not because it was solved, but because it had evolved into something else entirely, the foundation of modern drug policy, the template for international prohibition, and a cautionary tale that would influence how societies respond to addiction for the next century. Dr. Vincent Dole, who had proposed maintenance therapy during the crisis only to be ignored, finally published his comprehensive study of the epidemic in 1940. His report, The Paris Experiment, Lessons in Pharmaceutical Dependency, archived at the Rockefeller Institute, contained a devastating assessment of what had gone wrong and what could have been done differently. We witnessed the transformation of a medical problem into a criminal enterprise, not because of the nature of the substance itself, but because of our response to it. Dole wrote, "Every policy decision from prohibition to criminalization to punishment-based treatment made the crisis worse rather than better. The tragedy of Paris is not that heroin addiction occurred, but that we chose the most destructive possible responses to it." His words would prove prophetic as country after country adopted variations of the same failed approaches that had devastated Paris. But there were also unexpected positive legacies. The crisis had forced the medical community to confront addiction as a genuine medical condition rather than a moral failing. Dr. Marie Niswander, building on observations from Paris, would eventually develop methadone maintenance therapy, finally providing the kind of medical approach that could have prevented much of the Paris tragedy if it had been available in the 1920s. The social workers who documented the epidemic's impact on families and children laid the groundwork for modern understanding of addiction as a family disease requiring comprehensive treatment. Their case studies, preserved in various European archives, became fundamental texts in social work education and child welfare policy. Perhaps most importantly, the writers and artists who survived their encounters with heroin left behind works of literature, music, and art that captured both the allure and the devastation of chemical dependency with unprecedented honesty. Their creative legacy provided future generations with artistic warnings about the seductive power of substances that promised to enhance human experience while ultimately diminishing it. The international cooperation that emerged from the crisis, flawed though it was, established the framework for global health policy that continues today. The League of Nations Health Initiatives, the international treaties, and the diplomatic protocols for addressing cross-border health crises all evolved from the world's response to the Paris epidemic. But the most profound legacy may be the questions that the epidemic raised about human nature itself. What does it mean that so many intelligent, creative, accomplished people could be seduced by a chemical promise of enhanced consciousness? What does it reveal about the human condition that addiction could transform love into mutual destruction, creativity into stagnation, and medical care into systematic harm? The Paris heroin epidemic forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about the relationship between consciousness, chemistry, and choice. It demonstrated that addiction isn't a failure of character, but a hijacking of biology, that prohibition creates more problems than it solves, and that moral approaches to medical problems inevitably cause more suffering than healing. These lessons remain relevant today as we face new epidemics involving opioids, stimulants, and synthetic drugs. The policy debates surrounding harm reduction versus abstinence, treatment versus punishment, and medical versus criminal approaches all echo the arguments that raged in 1920s Paris. Looking back at those beautiful, tragic years, when the City of Light became temporarily shadowed by pharmaceutical darkness, we can see both human frailty and human resilience. People made terrible choices, but they also demonstrated extraordinary capacity for love, creativity, and survival under impossible circumstances. The couples who found intimacy in shared addiction, the artists who created beauty while battling dependency, the children who adapted to chemically altered families, the doctors who tried to help within the constraints of their ignorance. All of these people were doing their best within systems that were poorly designed to support human flourishing. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of the Paris heroin epidemic, that individual choices happen within social, economic, and political contexts that can either support healthy decisions or make destructive ones seem rational. The tragedy wasn't that people chose heroin. It was that their society created conditions where heroin seemed like a reasonable choice. As we conclude this journey through one of history's most fascinating and heartbreaking chapters, I want to thank you for staying with me through this long, complex story. It's taken us through the intersections of medicine and culture, love and addiction, creativity and destruction, policy and human suffering. These weren't just statistics or historical curiosities. These were real people whose lives were shaped by forces they didn't fully understand, making choices within circumstances they didn't fully control. Their stories remind us that behind every epidemic, every policy failure, every social crisis, there are individual human beings trying to find meaning, connection, and relief from suffering. The story of 1920s Paris heroin epidemic isn't just history. It's a mirror reflecting our own struggles with substances, policies, and the eternal human search for transcendence. Whether we learn from their mistakes or repeat them remains an open question. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows and light of one of Paris's most complex decades. Next time, we'll explore another fascinating chapter of history that reveals unexpected truths about human nature and the societies we create together. Until then, sweet dreams, and remember, even in the darkest stories, there are always lessons about resilience, hope, and the incredible complexity of the human experience.